Hello there. Welcome to Heyman Nature. I am Adam Heyman, and today I have a conversation with the great Bob Murphy, economist. And we are talking about a word that I'm sure you have thought of a lot over the last 3 or 4 days or 5 days, if not longer, especially if you've gone and looked at your stock portfolio and wondered what the heck is going on. You've probably been having this little word running through your brain, and that word is tariff. And so Bob and I are going to examine that subject and the repercussions of tariff policy in the United States and abroad from all manner of different angles that is sure to illuminate your understanding, arm you intellectually, and make you look at the thing in a different way. I guarantee it.
Heyman Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Heyman.
Hello, Bob. How you doing?
Hey, Adam. I'm doing better than the stock market, am I right?
Who knew? Such a simple thing that one little word, beautiful little word, tariff, could cause so much confusion and mayhem and destroy so much.
China. Sorry, go ahead.
China. So yeah, we've talked about tariffs before, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll link to those episodes. But things are really getting heated up, so maybe we should talk about them some more and what they are, what their effects are, whether we should hate them or love them, be afraid of them, and specifically some of the arguments that you'll see bandied about, pro or con, and whether those arguments make sense.
And in particular, I would definitely want to make sure we hit Adam. I am open to the idea because, as we'll see, folks, and those of you who know my work know that for me, like the case against tariffs is overwhelming. Like it's just there's 9 different ways of seeing it, and once you quote see it, it's like oh, and yet what's been astonishing to me is not that the government's doing something I think is dumb. Like that's pretty that happens all the time. News at 6, but there are Twitter accounts, just to give the examples of what I mean. There are Twitter accounts run by Thomas Sowell fans and Frederick Bastiat fans who were not giving super nuanced, well, if they use the revenue from the tariff to reduce income tax, but no, like using pretty standard protectionist rhetoric to defend the tariffs and mocking the opponents. And people like on the Thomas Sowell were posting video of Thomas Sowell himself aghast at this and like, what are you doing? And so anyway, like that's really what's astonishing to me. And I'm just, my world is crumbling that I'm wondering what the heck have like the free market economists been doing for the last 20 years? Like, in other words, there are people in our fan base who are just like, yeah, because, anyway, so that's what I'm trying to get at the bottom. And I know a bunch of my colleagues, when I posted thoughts along these lines on Twitter, were basically, it's because they're all stupid, Bob. It's not your fault. We're awesome. If the world, if you're not gaining traction, it's because everyone's stupid. And, my line was, if half the class bombs the tests, the teacher's doing something wrong. Like, yeah, you can come up with scenarios and all in this school district, and the kids really were bad, and it's not that, but that's kind of, I think, a general rule. If half the class bombs the test, teacher's doing something wrong. So I really do want to figure out in this discussion that you and I are about to have, what are my blind spots here that this, I was not expecting this to happen.
Oh, I have some educated guesses.
Okay.
Like, for example, I will say that the percentage of the country in favor of tariffs was much, much smaller 10 years ago, say.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, we've had a big increase in this country and in parts of Western Europe in nationalism as protection against globalism. And so this view of tariffs feeds into that. Mm-hmm. And then an even bigger thing, I think, is what we went through in COVID when the supply chains got disrupted and people started to get freaked out that maybe it's super unwise to have so many things that we rely on coming from so far overseas, such that if something bad happens, we can't get access. And hey, what if they just decide they don't like us anymore? And The CCP decides it's illegal to sell blah, blah, blah to Americans.
Right.
So there's that vulnerability. And then there's always been the national security carve out. We can't, we have to have tariffs on steel because we need steel to build battleships and aircraft carriers. And what if we go to war? So I think they're, as we talk about a lot, it's usually the emotion or something else that causes the conclusion, and then you reason backwards to figure out why you have that conclusion. And so I think a bunch of that stuff is just sort of cooking around in people's guts, making them think in terms of protecting the nation's something, balance of trade, manufacturing capacity, stuff.
Okay. Yeah, and that dovetails with what I'm seeing. For example, this is literally today as we're recording this, that I was seeing this element. So folks, we're recording this on April 7th, and it's day, I think 3 of the market super fallout from this stuff. And so now I've seen making the rounds, Adam, I don't know if it's on your radar, that younger people saying stuff like, oh, I'm supposed to feel bad because a bunch of boomers' stock portfolios getting hit when they were willing to ruin my future because they were afraid of a virus that was going to, they had a 99.7% survival rate and blah, blah. So I am seeing there is this element of that. Yeah. Or another thing is like, oh yeah, I'm willing to take a hit to, not be able to afford cheap crap at Walmart from China if it sticks it to the globalists, so I am seeing things like that. So there are elements of this beyond just the pure economics at play. So I guess I see that, but it still, like for an analogy, and I just want to make sure people get where I'm coming from. To be clear, I'm not saying, oh, don't people understand that it's more efficient, to have the TVs produced in China and then we produce wheat and then don't they get, and they're saying, yeah, but we get that. And we're talking about, I'm not merely making an argument like that, but what I'm saying is when people are talking about, like here's an analogy, that if you saw a bunch of people coming forward, like supposedly intelligent policy wonk types, and they were saying, yes, I really like the Department of Defense's new policy that they're going to equip all of their troops with perpetual motion machines. Because when we have our guys out there on the front line, it's do or die, and we really want to make sure they all are equipped with state-of-the-art perpetual motion machines. And then, somebody is coming back and saying, what are you talking about? It doesn't even make sense. And say, listen, national security is a lot more important than physics, all right? Or than your conservation of energy. So, and you can see how, like, if you were a physics professor, you would be like, what the heck did we obviously didn't get through these people like this. That's kind of where I am, that it's the arguments people are making. They think the tariffs are going to do things that they're not going to do. And
they think that they're not going to do things that they are going to do. Like the kid or whatever saying, oh, a bunch of boomers, you're losing all your stock portfolio. Ha ha ha, screw you. You don't care about me. Well, tariffs don't just impact the valuation of stocks. It increases the prices of everything in a very coordinated and structured, and it's going to impact you too, kid. And when people are just so glib dismissing quote unquote market efficiency, I don't think they know what that means. Like they're interested in having a much, much, much lower quality of life, literally every day, because they can't afford as much as they could have if we didn't have these tariffs in place. I mean, the division of labor is a true and powerful phenomenon, and you can't just pretend it doesn't exist. Try narrowing all production down to your cul-de-sac, and you'll see right away what the effects are.
Yeah, if maybe Adam, if you'll just let me do my little presentation real quickly here, because otherwise, I want to get in the conversation with you, and otherwise this is like hanging on the back of my head. So let me just show this. So folks, in the background here, Adam, I had this epiphany last night as I was wrestling and I couldn't go to sleep because the public was not understanding. Let me give one more example, though, to make sure people get what my lament was. Because I saw a bunch of political cartoons or whatever or I guess memes at this point. Political cartoon sounds way more formal than it was. But it was like panes of a cartoon showing the evolution of the argument. And the idea was that, the people who are for free trade what they're saying is, yes, this is hurting me. I'm worse off, but I feel better knowing that global market efficiency has been promoted. And then the author of this cartoon was like, no, we're done doing that. And they even used the term comparative advantage. Like, I mean, so the person knew enough economics to know, but what they thought comparative advantage said was that, yes, your country is made poorer by free trade, but at least you're helping global capitalism or global efficiency or something. And I was like, no, that is not at all what comparative advantage is, right? So that's what I mean, that these people, like, they obviously have some knowledge of it. Otherwise, they wouldn't even use that term, but they don't know literally the first thing about it. And so I'm just like, geez. And again, it's not like those videos, where the guy goes out to a bar at outside the strip of bars at 1 a.m. and grabs drunk girls and asks them to name, 13 state capitals or something. That's not what we're talking about. These are people who are pseudo-intellectual doing that. That's why I'm just so like, whoa, this is worse than I realized. So anyway, just real quickly here, let me just show. So Trump, in his speech where he was motivating all this stuff, had some line like, from 1789 to 1913, the U.S. was primarily raised revenue through tariffs, and then he said, then for reasons unknown in 1913 they had an income tax, and during that period from 1789 to 1913 under tariffs, it was the strongest, the wealthiest economy in percentage terms or proportionally. He said something like that, right? So if you're a MAGA fan, and you liked the tariff thing and whatever, or hey, let's give it a shot. Let's just, stop poo-pooing America. Trump, let's give him a chance, that kind of thing. I'm guessing you think the U.S. had a trade surplus during that period, right? That's probably what you think. And the epiphany I had last night is I knew, oh no, I've actually known for decades that the U.S. in its founding era had massive constant trade deficits. Okay, so let me just show that. And then, just real quickly, I'll explain the point of it. So here's and this is from a St. Louis Fed thing produced by globalist analysts working for Klaus Schwab. So this chart is showing the U.S. goods trade balance. So it's not actually the overall trade balance, but I don't think there was much international trade and services back in the day. It's technically from 1800 up to whatever, 2020, something like that. And so you can see, here the zero line is in the middle here. So up until 1875-ish, it was pretty consistently negative, okay? And then there was a gentle trade surplus. They had a huge surge around 1900, and then a big one in World War I, actually, and then another one right after World War II. But it was, slightly positive, and then it was only in the early 70s that it started going negative again, and then it, just fell off a cliff, okay? And then it's even more pronounced. You can see it with manufacturing. So that was just the overall goods in general. But then if you look at manufacturing versus raw materials, you can see this starts in like 1820 and goes up to like 1970-ish, this one. But the manufactured goods, it got negative up until like 1895. And then the raw materials there was a surplus. But the point is, the U.S.'s trade deficit in manufactured goods was bigger than its surplus in raw materials, such that overall the U.S. had a negative trade balance, up until 1890 or something. So I want to make sure people realize that. So as far as Trump saying, a trade deficit means we're losing, the rest of the world's ripping us off, I'm saying for most of that period where Trump is saying, oh yeah, back in the golden days when the U.S. economy was awesome, we just had tariffs. I'm saying throughout that entire period, almost, the U.S. had a huge trade deficit, particularly in manufactured goods. Okay. And so the point I want to make is that I've been making all these different podcasts that I've been doing and writing on this stuff, is a trade deficit isn't necessarily a bad thing. Right. And so the early period, I agree with Trump that, yeah, the U.S., that trade deficit was consistent with it being an economic powerhouse. And the idea is, I could do a thought experiment and I even had this, I wrote a novel some may know called Minerva about these anarcho-capitalist guys buy some little tiny island in the Pacific from some, despot, and they put in Rothbardia, And so what happens in the early years is capital and, crude oil and other things from around, semi-finished goods, materials to build factories from all over the world would flow to this little piece of land in the Pacific because everybody would know, oh, the productivity there is way higher than it is anywhere else on planet Earth. So what would you do? You would want to move all your production there. So in the beginning, there would be huge trade deficits, right? All these goods would be flowing in there instead of coming out. And then over time, as it matured and turned into the powerhouse that people knew it had the potential to be, then, eventually it would flip and stuff on net would be shooting out of it, right? So that's what I think was going on in the beginning there in the U.S. And then on the flip side, though, don't worry, Adam, I'm just about done with my soliloquy here. On the flip side, there's a lot of free trade, laissez-faire economists who think they don't just say trade deficit could be anything, and they don't just make an appeal to freedom, but they go so far as to say, no, a trade deficit's good. And they, and they'll say things like that are also wrong. And I would point, that same chart that I just showed a minute ago showing how the U.S. had a trade deficit in the beginning, then in the middle period, it was a surplus, and then it went negative starting in the 70s. Right. I think the big trade deficits the U.S. has been running since the mid-70s onward are not because it's so awesome and it's analogous to Rothbardia floating in the Pacific Ocean. No, I think it's because they've been living beyond their means. Like the standard protectionist critique, I think is accurate. And especially like the U.S. government has run up a $36 trillion debt or whatever, in the last couple of decades. And that dovetails, by the way, pretty nicely with the decline in what's called the net international investment position that a lot of protectionists have been pointing to. Like, what the heck's going on here? We're getting crushed by these foreigners. They're like taking over our financial assets. So anyway, all that's to say, if you're a supporter of Trump, were you surprised by that chart? And if you were, shouldn't that alarm you? Like, that's the thing. I posted that chart, and I don't think I changed anybody's mind about anything. I think the people that thought Trump was an idiot were like, yeah, idiot. And the people who thought he was awesome were just, didn't know what to say, or some were just saying, well, yeah, I mean, it took a while for us to become the powerhouse, but then, anyway, I'll stop there, Adam, but it's just both sides in this are disappointing me. I'm mad at everybody. It's basically what it is.
Laments all around for Dr. Murphy. I think you're right. I think showing that chart isn't going to convince anybody of anything. And it brings me to mind another thing we talk about all the time, but just about how complex the world is and how much people have been lied to with charts and graphs. And yeah, you're showing me a thing and you're making a claim for a cause and effect relationship, but the economy is really, really complicated, and there's a lot of things that were going on there, and you're not taking all those things into account. You're just trying to fool me, Mr. Smarty PhD guy. But I know in my gut what's right, and that's why I'll never be convinced by anything. And well, to bolster my point, I was combing the internet to try and find what people thought were literally the strongest arguments in favor of Trump's tariffs. Here was one of the absolute most persuasive.
Hang on. You mean according to them, or you mean the ones you've personally of what
according to them?
Okay.
Slam dunks. Just, you shut up, silly. You don't understand. And here's the first one. If tariffs are so bad, Dr. Economist guy, why do other countries impose them?
Oh, yeah. That
is a slam dunk mic drop argument for people who are in favor of tariffs.
Yeah, I think that was the one that made me stop and say we're doing something wrong here. Like my colleagues and I who've been preaching free market dogma for 20 years, we completely wasted our time. That one.
It made me turn my computer off and go for a walk. I couldn't understand what I was looking at.
So for the benefit, and by the way, in case folks, some of you are blessed to not be on social media all the time, like Adam and I are, it was clearly like there was some kind of messaging like this. It was like wild. I don't know if it was literal bots or what, but I mean, I saw some Republican congressmen sharing it too. And so like the people that were definitely, some of them had heartbeats, but I mean, it was like, there was a 48-hour stretch where I saw it dozens of times. And then I saw someone who like did a collage and had gone and grabbed screenshots. So it was like the flip side of on the news when they would always like under the Biden administration, when the local anchor, they always had the same talking points and then somebody would assemble a collage of them all saying that. Like that's what it was here, but on social media for support for Trump's tariffs. So yeah, I mean, so number one, it's dumb because foreign governments do all kinds of stupid stuff. But number two, you know who really hates European governments? Trump fans, right? Like, so should we have socialized medicine? Should we have a really high minimum wage? Should we have all kinds of labor regulations that makes it hard for businesses to lay workers off and stuff?
Should we ban guns and
Yep.
samurai swords?
Yep. Should we lock people up for saying, denying the Holocaust?
Or for COVID? Or should we have huge government debt? I mean, other countries do it. Do we want to be left out? Massive welfare systems, huge regulatory impositions on the productive class. I mean, we don't want to not be like these other countries. They must be doing it for good reasons, right?
Right. Yeah. Don't tell me that European welfare states are bad for the economy, because then why would they be doing it? Duh. So anyway, that's why I was. Or another one recently I saw was.
Hold on, before we
before
we move from that one, when I saw it, as I was taking my walk with my computer turned off because it was steaming. I thought one of the big, huge problems here is that we collectivize everything. We do everything in aggregate, and we confuse what the operating parts are, what nouns are doing what verbs. Countries don't act. People act. It's a person or a business maybe that buys something from one place or another, and it's not countries actually even that impose tariffs. It is politically connected groups of people with their own agendas that convince politicians to enact tariffs in order to increase their own standard of living at the expense of the rest of their countrymen in the case of tariffs. And I think we get really dumb when we just think of US v China and, we're losing. I mean, Trump says it all the time. They're handing us our lunch. And I don't even think people have the slightest idea what he means by that. It's probably not the same thing that's in their head. But it's not like country v country. That's not the right way to look at the world. Countries don't buy grain. People do. Businesses do maybe, but countries don't trade with one another. That's not the operating actor.
Right, and I guess that this is a good time for me to segue into this point that I think we should certainly hit in this episode is there are rationales you could give for enacting tariffs. But the way they were sprung on people, for example, if they put in higher tariffs and they use it to reduce dollar for dollar income taxes,
sure,
like that would make sense. And especially if you combined it with regulatory relief and blah, 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 you could do that kind of stuff. And I'd like to say, I think I've been one of the few economists who's tried to be fair to both sides, over the last 3 months on this stuff. And making that case and not just like, why don't you guys crack an economics book? Duh, that kind of thing. Okay, but that's not what they've been doing. And then, like you say, so the White House coming out with its tables with the reciprocal tariff rates and saying, this is what they're levying on us. And it's just amazing how many Trump fans keep reporting it, even though cynics came forward and said, whoa, these aren't tariff rates. They're just taking the trade deficit we have with them and dividing by, our imports from them. And that's how they're coming up with the percentage. And then White House officials have confirmed that. What I mean? This isn't just speculated. They've come forward and said, yep, that's what we mean, because we think that's a good proxy for their unfair trading. Okay, so, it's hard. The analogy I used was to say that's kind of like with the leftist progressives when they accuse corporate America of having institutional racism. And so they'll say, this big company right here, oh yeah, it's institutional racism. You'll say, why? You have like some memos from, HR people talking about how they don't like black people? No. Oh, you found some kind of policy in their books about when you consider job applicants, give more weight to the white. No. So what do you mean? Well, because look, it's just of their workforce, you can see the percentage of white employees is higher or is higher there than, in the community at large. And so therefore, so that's what I mean, what they're doing here, that they're just pointing and saying, oh, the fact that we have a trade deficit with this country is prima facie evidence they must be doing something unfair. When no, there's all kinds of things. And it goes into too, like you were saying with Trump clearly saying, if we have a trade deficit with a country, it's because we're losing somehow. What's so crazy about that is even in terms of his own private business, that's not how you would do business, right? As a real estate developer, surely what you would care about is the profit and loss statement for the business as a whole, not looking and saying, hey, this company that sells bricks, it seems like year in and year out, Trump Enterprises keeps buying more bricks from them than they buy of our hotels. What the hell's going on here? They're kind of ripping us off. It would be insane.
It doesn't even make sense on their own country to country metric. Like free traders are often saying, I have an incredible trade deficit with the grocery store. It's crazy. They don't buy anything for me. Well, it works like that in the real world too. Like you might have a trade imbalance with you and Germany or something, but then it goes the other way between them and France, and then maybe France buys your thing. I mean, there's all sorts of intermingled connections here. Who cares what the seesaw between two countries is? I mean, in this incredibly complicated, interconnected world, just who cares? It literally doesn't matter. Why should the average guy care about the number of the trade imbalance?
I mean, right. But I'm saying, even if you did want to be fair to their perspective, that's to kind of go back to my analogy. I didn't spell it out with the institutional racism stuff. Somebody, who's defending a corporation that they, the amount of black or Hispanic employees they have on staff is lower percentage wise than in the surrounding community where the buildings are located. And someone saying, see, they're racist. And then the defense saying, no, there's all sorts of innocuous, benign explanations for this outcome. And then for someone to say, so you're saying racism doesn't exist? That's just all in our head. And he said, well, no, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying we need more. So likewise here, when people were criticizing the commerce, was it Lutnick? Him and Besant and those guys, were being hit with this formula. You guys are talking about tariffs when this is just a trade deficit. What's going on? And they were like, just started getting anecdotal about, well, no, I mean, do you know that this country did this? You know what I mean? Like pointing to just like somebody who was defending the claim of institutional racism was, would you know cops in this one city beat up this guy one time just because he was black? And yeah, I'm not denying that. But so anyway, that's what I'm saying, that, yeah, if they want to point to specific practices, and I'm not denying that there are foreign governments that do things that disadvantage U.S. exports into their country. Yeah. So deal with those and then lay out what the thing is, and here's what we're going to do, but not just, well, in general, like you're saying, that the trade deficit per se is evidence that something is afoot here. That it said, like, just for the same reason Trump Enterprises, or whatever the name of his companies were, has a trade deficit with the people who sell bricks and the people that sell glass and the construction, subcontractors, whatever, that give labor, and he's got big trade surpluses with the developers that pay for the casinos and whatnot. I mean, his business has trade surpluses and deficits with other organizations all the time. And that's not, so anyway, it's for years, Trump, back in his first term too, he was talking as if the trade balance of the U.S. vis-a-vis some other nation is analogous to a company's profit and loss statement. And that's just in general, even for the U.S. as a whole, or for the U.S. vis-a-vis the world, you could understand where he's coming from. Like, it would still be wrong, but okay. But to do it on a bilateral country by country basis is just insane.
Yeah, definitely. Let me draw from the well of the internet's very, very popular and supposedly persuasive defenses for what Trump is doing. They'll say to you, I guess you didn't read The Art of the Deal. Look, these tariffs, what Trump is doing, they're just used for negotiations. Don't worry, they're obviously not meant to be permanent. And when he's done, we'll have lowered tariffs across the world. And isn't that what you want, Mr. Free Trader guy? To which I just say, really? Says who? What happens when other countries don't believe Trump or call his bluff? I guess these things are going to be permanent now. And I also don't believe that Trump wants necessarily tariffs lowered to zero all across the world. I think he wants to use the power of government to force companies to bring manufacturing back to America, because in his head, that means we're a better country. We're making America great again by getting us down to the middle of the chart you were just showing, where we manufactured more than we and exported more than we imported. So, I mean, do you think, well, first of all, what do you think about that crazy argument? And second of all, what do you think Trump's point is, or does he have one?
So, yeah, and that's what I was saying 10 minutes ago. I've been trying to be fair and to give credence that, yeah, there are economists who are well versed in comparative advantage and they know the economics textbooks and whatever, and they're in favor of the kind of stuff Trump's doing, including what's his name, Stephen Moran, the head of the CEA, Council of Economic Advisors. I covered with now I'm blanking on the guys from Ole Miss, Josh something. I'm blanking on his name. We went through. There was like a 40-page document that Moran released last November or something about rebalancing the global structure of trade or something using tariffs and blah, blah, blah. So that was all, he didn't say anything demonstrably stupid, Moran, in that essay. He was referring to the published literature. There's optimal tariff theory. And if the U.S. imposes tariffs, it's not as damaging as if some small country did because, the U.S. is such a big market that effectively other countries will eat some of it to still be able to sell into our market. That's kind of the deal. Like the U.S. imposing tariffs will lower global prices for certain items, whereas if some little tiny country did it, global price wouldn't budge. Okay, so I've done all that, and yeah, one argument people will make is the one you're saying, and the strategic one. So number one, I'd say, okay, that's fine, but then the argument's analogous to a guy going into a bank. He gives the teller a note and says, I'm strapped with dynamite. Give me $100,000 or I'm blowing us all up. And, that may work. And so, but you wouldn't conclude that therefore blowing yourself up with dynamite is the key to prosperity. You would just say, yeah, that was a bluff. And as long as they, don't call your bluff and you win and you don't have to exercise that option, okay. But that's not the way Trump is talking. He's not saying, yeah, I know tariffs are making Americans poorer, but just trust me, folks, that, I'm going to impose this pain on you because I think they're going to relent. But yeah, if I didn't think they were going to relent, I wouldn't do this because I realize taxing Americans isn't the key. That's not how he's talking at all.
Also, I find it hard to believe that he's the first politician ever to acknowledge that lower tariffs in general are better. But he's the first one to think about maybe threatening reciprocal tariffs to get them to lower. I don't believe that's the first time that sort of thing has been tried.
Well, that's the thing too. I mean, I don't know enough of the details, but that's the whole logic of these international trade agreements.
Right.
Where it's like, oh, you cede some of your, and I'm not in favor of these things, but I'm just saying that's the logic of it, that everybody knows that, yes, if we had free trade or relatively free trade, at least for certain types of goods and stuff, that would be better for everybody involved. But then there are all these incentives for people to deviate. Again, not because it helps their country as a whole, but because, they have a politically protected class. Because tariffs are the classic example of what economists call concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, right? Mm-hmm. So the automakers, if they can get Washington to levy a tariff against Japanese cars, that's good for Detroit automakers, like including their shareholders and the workers, and it makes car prices higher for U.S. consumers, right? And so, the people, so there's that element. So the function of these treaty, like the World Trade Organization, all this stuff is supposed to be, all the signatories are agreeing to these rules of fair trade and blah, blah, blah. And then if some country cheats and then, you as an aggrieved party can go take it to the council and then you can levy retaliatory tariffs or whatever on them. Like they'll allow it, that kind of thing. So they're trying, it's basically going towards one world government. So that's partly why I don't like it. And that's like somebody like Murray Rothbard was with Pat Buchanan on not liking NAFTA and not liking the WTO or anything, even though Buchanan was a protectionist and Rothbard was a free trader, but Rothbard smelled a rat and was like, yeah, I don't like this managed gobbledygook that's, moving us towards one world government. So there is that, but that was my very long-winded way, Adam, of agreeing with you that, this notion of if some country's playing a hardball and deviating from free trade, you can just punish them and say, we will relent when you do. Like that's kind of what the whole point of these international agreements is.
Yeah, bad way to get there. I agree with you. On that concentrated benefits and dispersed costs thing, I'm sure these numbers aren't exactly correct, but I ran across them today. Trump's steel tariffs cost consumers $900,000 for each job created. And if that's true, and I think it's probably close, you'd be better off just, how much do those jobs pay? It's way less than $900,000. Let's just give them half and not do the tariff. We'll put them on the dole, and it'll be less expensive to the rest of the country.
Yeah. So every time, and there were analyses like that talking about what was it? Ronald Reagan had like voluntary quotas or something on Japanese cars or something like that. It's voluntary, like your taxes are voluntary. I remember they had things like, yes, for every job saved in Detroit, Americans collectively paid $300,000 when, they were only making $60,000 a year in their salary or whatever. So, and the point of that is to underscore what economists mean when they say tariffs make the country poorer on average or per capita.
Yeah, the
We're
whole
not denying,
extras, the dead weight loss. Yeah.
yeah, that there's some people do benefit. Obviously, the quote protected industries do benefit, but then other people lose. And the point is, it's not just a wash, that there's a definite quantifiable sense in which the losses to the losers are bigger in the aggregate than the gains to the winners. And that's the sense in which economists say, tariffs in general, make the world poorer. So
there was there was a stat, I grabbed it just because it was funny, but washing machine tariffs cost $820,000 per job, which, I don't know, it just seemed funny. Washing machines.
Yeah. So I will say with those things, it's not like measuring the charge on an electron. Right?
Of course.
You could make, you could come in and make the art anywhere from like 200,000 probably to 1.6 million for that washing machine one, and you wouldn't be lying. So I'm just saying that a lot of those things, take it with a grain of salt, but I think the general principle for sure is correct. Then that's what economists mean when they say that, it imposes more harms than it showers benefits. And that's also why too, like if you just took it to the logical extreme, the broader base the tariffs are, the less it's helping anybody. Right. So if you just had a tariff on Japanese cars, that would clearly make Detroit auto worker, or wherever they are located in the U.S. now, U.S. auto workers and their shareholders better off. And it would make prices higher for consumers for buying cars. Right. But then if you also had a tariff on all electronic goods from China, well, now those auto workers who are benefiting from the tariff on the Japanese cars, well, now the higher wages they're getting don't go as far when they go to the store, because now all those Chinese goods are more expensive too. Or so each tariff you put in place on more and more of the imports is, helping a different group of people and then harming consumers in general, but the harms are always bigger than the gains. And so the more you do that, after a while, there's fewer and fewer Americans who are net beneficiaries from the whole thing.
For sure. When you said charge on electron, it reminded me, I want to throw a bone to the White House was really, really stupid. I think they literally were measuring the trade deficit as a share of imports and dividing by 2 or something like that, which is obviously wrong. On the other hand, there's a bunch of other stuff that countries do that protectionists would call, not fair.
Right.
Like quotas or whatever the value-added tax does, or currency manipulations, or there's a whole basket of things people, and obviously to do a presentation in a rose garden, they're not going to be able to disentangle all of that. So do you have anything you want to say about those extra things and how they're like tariffs or not like tariffs? Or
and again, so just to tie it back, I was saying I'm not denying those things exist. It's just to come up with and just to say we're going to tariff the world because of this, because we can point to some anecdotal, like that's kind of nutty. But yes, there are other measures countries. For example, one claim is that the Chinese government deliberately undervalues their currency in order to promote exports. And so the way that could work, or would work, is the Chinese government taxes its people, so it has money, yuan, and then they go into the currency markets and they use yuan to buy U.S. dollars, and then they take the dollars and they buy U.S. treasuries. Right, so they clearly, I haven't looked at the latest figures, I don't know in the last year or two what they've done, but over the last 30 years, the Chinese authorities have accumulated a huge stockpile of U.S. treasuries. All right, so to get into, well, are they cheating? Is this currency manipulation? You kind of would have to get in their head and know, well, why are they doing it? Because if they're just doing it because, hey, the dollar is the reserve currency and we want to be insulated in a global economy, and in case, our currency has pressure, we want, because that's their official rationale. That's why they said it was after like the Asian flu in the late 90s and stuff that the Chinese government started doing that, and they wanted to reassure investors about the yuan's stability. But the point is, in so doing, what does that do? That makes the dollar stronger against the yuan than it otherwise would be, right? And so then that makes it harder for Chinese people to import U.S. goods, right? Because the stronger the dollar is for a given dollar sticker price, our goods are more expensive to them. And then vice versa, the stronger the dollar is for a given yuan sticker price of goods made in China, American consumers are like, oh, that's pretty cheap. Just like if you're a tourist and you go to some foreign country and you're looking at the menu and stuff and it's in their currency and you're like, well, how much is this? It depends on what the exchange rate is, right? So the better the exchange rate, like the cheaper it is to you. So that's the deal. So that's one allegation, that the Chinese authorities, by them deliberately weakening their currency, and how do they do that? By loading up on U.S. Treasury debt that makes it harder for us to export to them, in addition to all the other obstacles they may put in the way. So that's just one example of things countries can, or other governments can subsidize their exporters, right? So like if they want some powerful company that's making aircraft parts, if their government subsidizes, particularly if they subsidize exports, they say, oh yeah, if you can get a U.S. company to buy these turbines or something, then we'll subsidize you. We'll pay for 20% of it or something. Well, then that company can afford to sell below cost in terms of the sticker price. And so how can U.S. manufacturers be expected to compete with that, right? So that's some of the arguments. I don't know. I'll stop there. That's the kind of thing they mean. I mean, do you want me to say who cares?
No. That's. I mean, I don't care.
Well, I mean, just to fit it real quick. So in the limit, like if some foreign government wanted to just spend a bunch of money accumulating TVs and just giving to Americans for free, that would make it hard to be a TV manufacturer in the United States. But on the other hand, we're getting all these free TVs, right? And that's kind of like going back to Bastiat's petition of the candle makers, that in the limit, is it making us poorer that we get all this sunlight during the daytime for free? Like, doesn't that hurt jobs in the candle making industry? And it's like, no, that would be stupid so likewise, if the Chinese want to send us free TVs, it would be kind of stupid for us to say, no, we're going to make them ourselves, when our workers and materials could be doing something else if we were having free TVs come in.
Yeah, that reminds me. Don't we end this episode? I have a Bastiat quote that is appropriate.
In the original French?
Would you like me to pretend to be suffering electric convulsions and try to pronounce it? No, I'm just going to say it in English.
All right.
As you were speaking, in the limit, what if they just gave us all the TVs? I guess nationalists and people just predisposed to think America ought to make everything would immediately have an intuition that if they were just dumping TVs to the point where there's just no point us even investing in TV manufacturing, well, what about when the other shoe drops and they take advantage of our weakness in manufacturing and now they've got us over a barrel? And, people will just think like that. We're being taught to be completely dependent on the great TV gods for our TVs, and then we'll be vulnerable to them in some way.
So you can see it reached. I was trying to find a bigger, a chart that went back further, but so this is an index and it's in real terms. So of manufacturing output in the U.S. So it reached an all-time peak going into the financial crisis, right? Like the first quarter 2008, or I guess last quarter 2007 was the highest, and then it dropped a lot, and then it didn't fully recover since then. So something is screwy with the U.S. economy, since the global financial crisis. And I would say, well, yeah, there's not, it's not like Obama then forward, they all had all sorts of free market laissez-faire policies, and that's what we should attribute the economic stagnation to, right? That they certainly, the U.S. authorities were not doing what the Austrians would have suggested following 2007. But up until that point, you can say that U.S. manufacturing output was at an all-time high, okay? And so employment wasn't, right? So it's true that the share of the U.S. workforce that was in manufacturing over the decades, was shrinking, but just so as an economist, okay, right, and there's fewer people in agriculture in 1950 than there had been in the year 1900. But U.S. agricultural output was way higher in 1950 than in 1900, right? So that's a sign of efficiency when it takes fewer of your workers to produce more of that sector of stuff, right? So that's one thing I would say. And then I guess just to make sure we hit these, the people making arguments about, but there's real targeted things like for military defense and stuff like that. And right, but to say like, oh, we need to have some semiconductors made in the United States. Okay, then the Department of Defense, when it has contracts that it awards, like that's, something that it can take into account to say, well, we want to make sure in the event of a war, just like, I don't know if I've made this joke here, Adam, but like you wouldn't want to say, let's restrict all immigration and have closed borders because we can't have the Secret Service hiring Russians to protect the president. You know what I mean? Like you would say, no, how about just when they're interviewing for the job of who's going to be the Secret Service, they take into account, do we think this guy is a spy? Not, we got to really interfere with all the labor markets to prevent, you know what I mean? So that kind of deal that if it's real specific things that you think have military uses, okay. And then also too, like just to cover it while we're talking about, like with the COVID supply chain stuff, it's amazing to me, I'm not surprised when some leftist says we can't trust the market to plant trees. That's why we need the government to manage the national forest, because otherwise the capitalists would just cut down all the trees and sell it for wood today, and then we'd have no more trees. As if like capitalists can't look forward and understand how things work like that. And that's, it's not like the farmers kill all the chickens and then, oh shoot, we don't have any more chickens, right? And so likewise, a lot of people were shocked by what happened during COVID and the supply chains and whatever. And so I think the people who are in those industries would know, oh yeah, that's possible now. And so maybe I want to diversify my supply chains and things. So it's, again, it's just depressing to me that the knee-jerk response of people on the right who supposedly know, are fans of Thomas Sowell and Frederick Bastiat is, oh yeah, there's some issue going on now. Clearly the way to solve this is to have people in Washington implement a solution. Like it's just so disheartening that that's the go-to move.
Let's talk about another bad argument, and maybe this is a case of one bad argument meeting another. But you'll have people pointing to the tanking of the stock market and saying, "See, this is because tariffs make us less rich. It lowers the flow of the income stream of profits that the companies are going to make, and these tariffs also make regime uncertainty a thing. Capitalists don't know how to invest properly in such an uncertain regime." And you'll hear people say, you can't pay attention to the stock market. Stock markets collapse all the time. I mean, how do you know that this isn't just a normal sell-off because stocks got overheated? Bubbles are a thing. The timing here is just a coincidence. You'll even hear or see on social media people say things like, this is really a great time. I mean, if you had cash and you were around in the Great Depression, well, that would be a great time to buy in just into the S&P 500. You should thank Trump because he's buy the dip. Things are going to be great after this. Don't you have any faith? You should be glad that the stock market is tanking. It's actually a good thing.
Mm-hmm. I've seen a bunch of good memes on that, like saying buy the dip, and then someone's saying there's been 3 dips. And,
buy the dippity dip.
Yeah, and or like with what? And then I saw a girl that I follow. She like went out to Applebee's or something and got a bunch of like the sampler plate and had a bunch of different dips, and she said I bought the dip. So anyway, good stuff. So, yes. So Gene Callahan and I have an article. It may be by the time we post this, it might even be out. So I'll link to it if that's the case, folks. Where he doesn't like, and I agree with him on the narrow technical point of people looking at declining stock prices as if that's the same thing as wealth being destroyed. Like, oh, Trump destroyed $30 trillion of wealth today. Good job, Donald. That strictly speaking, a price going down is, the one party gains and one loses, that kind of thing. So there's that element to get real specifics. But I think you're right that clearly stock prices are partly a reflection of expectations of future dividends and things like that. And yeah, if people think think that global trade is going to be severely hampered by this stuff and the retaliation that might come, falling stock prices are a good indication that the people with money on the line are betting that this is not going to go well. The thing about all this that really annoyed me was to see Trump fans retweeting Robert Reich, who said in 2020 when Biden came in that, again, the market tanked for some reason. I don't remember what the context was. and Robert Reich was giving statistics about like, oh, the top 1% own this many percent of the S&P 500. And he said, remember, the stock market's not the economy. So he was doing that to tell right-wingers lay off Joe Biden at the time.
Right.
And then now Trump fans are retweeting it, where I'm sure, number one, the Trump fans did not retweet that back, when it was Biden. And number two, I'm sure Robert Reich was not running around today or last week saying, no, let's not hold it against Donald Trump because of the stock market. And I'm sure, no, he was probably running victory laps about this shows, what an idiot Trump is, doesn't know how tariffs work. So, that's with all this stuff. And I'm sure you saw, Adam, too. People found clips from Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi from back in the day when they were like sounding just like Trump as far as China and whatever. And that's like, oh yeah, I remember back in my day, I'm old enough to remember when Republicans hated Russia and the Democrats wanted, to have diplomacy, and Republicans were for free trade and the Democrats were the ones that, distrusted China and stuff. That's kind of interesting.
It just goes to show it's always the same thing. I have this opinion of mine about good and bad, and I'm just going to reach up onto the shelf and find whatever justification kind of makes sense.
Yep.
And the fact that I'm a complete and utter hypocrite, so what? I have an interesting argument I want to fling at you. It's from a friend of mine who I don't want to name. I doubt I don't think he'd mind, but
we've only got two, so it's kind of easy now to narrow it down.
Be able to figure it out. Don't need the NSA for that. I was about to argue that, countries don't, it's cronies that advocate for tariffs, as we were discussing. It's Detroit wanting protection for their jobs at the cost of higher car prices for the rest of their countrymen. But he's claiming that Trump is putting crony versus crony in an attempt to reduce tariffs everywhere. Let me find his actual words. It's a little garbled because he was typing real fast, but most countries, especially developing ones, have really high tariffs built around corrupt industry connections. Trump is strangely pitting countries' special interests against their own national interests by increasing our own tariffs in an indiscriminate manner while negotiating mutual reductions. The hidden dynamic is the pressure on corrupt interests. This breaks people's brains because then why raise our tariffs if tariffs are bad? It's hard to fully dissect. The reason we can put the pressure on is we are in a much different position that enables us to afford it more. To which I said, that's interesting. I'm going to have to think about it. Translation, I'm going to ask my smart friend Bob Murphy what he thinks about that.
So, this kind of dovetails with the earlier question about, is this just 4D chess?
Right.
And let me say, I hope that is what happens,
for
right?
Sure.
And whether that was
sure.
literally Team Trump's plan, 2 weeks before this happened. By the way, I'm concerned though. Like, I don't know if you saw, like Elon tweeted out Milton Friedman doing the iPencil thing. Like, to me, that was Elon doing Morse code. Like, I am not on board with this.
Right.
Send reinforcements.
He was doing more than Morse code. He said straight up, nobody should have tariffs.
Okay. I didn't see that follow up. So anyway, yes, I hope, and again, whether this really was the plan all along or if Trump thought this was going to be awesome and then the tanking of the markets kind of caught him by surprise and people behind the scenes are like, well, how are we going to play this, sir? And he wants to even let countries do fig leaf things, but then claim it as a win. Like, I hope he does that. I will not begrudge him if Trump spins it so that he's awesome and all the critics were stupid and you guys all have egg on your faces. You were warning about a Great Depression and Smoot-Hawley and, we're going to get sick of so much winning. That's what I want to happen. I'm not going to be mad if Trump does that, even if that wasn't his plan. He gets lucky and gets out of it. And if it does, especially if it means there really are some lower tariffs all around, that'd be awesome. I guess the thing though is here's what I would say. I'm not making the case here, but in some of my other work, and then for people, if you go, I'm going to do this at the Human Action podcast. It'll run like April 9th, if you're looking afterward, that episode, where I'm going to just go through and show, given that Trump has a limited amount of political capital, I think the way you could easily get rid of U.S. trade deficits is if the U.S. government balanced its budget And then also if the Fed, it doesn't have to literally go back to a gold standard, but if it just adopted a harder stance, then I think, that's
Yeah.
why with the
Yeah.
chart I showed, I think that's why it's not a coincidence the U.S. trade deficit went negative, or trade balance went negative in the early 70s and then just went off a cliff, is that's when the U.S. flipped, got rid of the
Yep.
gold standard, and U.S. government started running huge budget deficits, and those two go, hand in hand. The
Yep.
fact that the Fed can monetize the debt, I think, is why they got away with doing it. So my point is, the people making the sophisticated argument, like your buddy and whatever, and some of the PhD economists advising Trump, all agree that yes, if we just thought Trump's going to jack up these tariffs and the other countries aren't going to blink, you're making Americans poor. You're hiking taxes. You're interfering with commerce. That doesn't help America. That doesn't help working Americans. And so I'm saying, okay, so rather than doing this high stakes thing where we're going to try to get to lower trade, but why don't you instead do something that's clearly a win-win, cutting taxes, cutting spending, making the money harder in the U.S., lowering tariffs, and then just lecturing the rest of the world and say, look at the barriers we have, and you're hurting your own people with your trade barriers against us, blah, blah. But, to me, that would make a lot more sense. And like I said, you would get rid of the trade deficit that way, as opposed to this thing, which might blow up in your face. So it's kind of like, hey, if you want to get more money from the bank, one way is to go in strapped with dynamite. That could work, but it might literally blow up in your face. Or you could go get a second job and stop going out to eat so much and save. And then when you need money, you go in the bank and it's there because you've saved it over the years. So that's kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah, you mentioned iPencil and Elon. Reminded me that Diogo Costa of Fee, which has a strong connection to the famous iPencil, just wrote a great piece, furious at Trump for what he's doing. I think it's written from the perspective of the pencil again. Anyway, we'll link to it. It's far too long to read, but it's great.
And the connection is that Leonard Read, I don't know if you said it, Leonard Read is the author of iPencil, and Milton Friedman was just doing a video.
And he founded Fee, Foundation for Economic Education. Yeah. So that's a great little read. We'll link to it in the video description and the show notes, which are at heymannature.com, where you'll find my Substack, and also bobmurphyshow.com. We're nearing an hour. Is there anything else you wanted to?
Did you want to give your voulez-vous?
I do.
Yeah,
I do. Bastiat, Economic Harmonies, the Law, Broken Window Fallacy, The Seen, the Unseen. He said about tariffs this, quote, protectionism, socialism, and communism are basically the same plant at three different stages of its growth. And I love that. A, it's very timely, and B, I hate seeing this right-wing populist movement embrace protectionism, because once you start thinking that way, then government control in all sorts of aspects of life starts to make sense, because why not? And I don't think Bastiat is wrong. It's what he saw way back in the day in France, and I think it's eternal.
I guess my only lament, and I don't know that we're going to be able to do it in 2 minutes, is I did want you to help me figure out, like, how did this happen? Like, how can it be? It doesn't surprise me that Republicans in general are bad on this. Okay, fine. But the people that have studied economics or whatever, why are they embracing tariffs? So, and I guess one answer is you're saying, well, a lot of them have more sophisticated art, what Trump's saying, he's just doing that. And really he's doing 4D chess. So they do kind of know that tariffs per se are bad. And okay, that's all right. But anyway.
Oh, well, I think they yearn for, trad wife is a thing again. I think people, you'll see pictures of the family, the wholesome family in the 50s. And, this is what leftists think is bad. I think they yearn for a period in time where they perceived as America being much more healthy, and maybe it was. And one of the elements of that, as well as your daughters and sons not being confused about what gender they are. But the one big thing is that you could have a single earner for a household and do very, very well and retire comfortably. And I think that they think that the reason we're not like that anymore is evil Klaus Schwab style globalism. And businesses just got greedy and went chasing cheap labor. And you need a big, strong government to try and fix that. And I'm sure there's some element of truth to that, but you can't ignore the 500 million government regulations that made manufacturing here in the United States way more expensive than it needed to be. Starting
Okay.
from the minimum wage
Yeah.
and
Okay.
a million other things.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So that's good. So then my own response, and we can end on, I don't need to beat this to death anymore. So yes, I think you're right that is a lot of it. And then I guess my disappointment, though, and I still think then we economists have done a bad job with this, is to say, okay, so basically you're saying, yeah, what has changed? Why is it? And I know some people quibble and say this image never was true, but yeah, the leave it to Beaver thing. You don't. So right now, yeah, housing's unaffordable and geez, the healthcare and blah, blah, blah. You don't fix that by making goods more expensive and lowering real wages, which is what tariffs do. You know what I mean? So that's not going to make housing cheaper to make people.
But the disconnect is they'll say in their mind, they're going to go, well, Bob doesn't understand that. Yeah, it won't fix that right now, but in 5 to 10 years, it totally will, because then we'll have gone back to 1955. And Bob just doesn't understand how when we retrench and make America great again, then the prices will come down and everything will be fine.
Yeah. So.
So there we are.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks. Agree to disagree. I'm on your side, by the way, Bob. Thank you, Bob. This was great. I wish we'd solved the entire tariff kerfuffle, but at least I hope we've given people more intellectual ammunition. Please go visit HeymanNature.com and go visit BobMurphyShow.com. And again, the show notes are all there and also in the video description at Bob's site and at my YouTube channel at Heyman Nature. And we will come at you again with more bewildering and confusing and educational information. You're welcome.
Take care, everybody.